It's June 10th, 2026. There's a big corporate push to build more nuclear power plants in the US, and I'll be speaking with Linda Penz Gunter. Prior to her environmental work, she was a journalist for 25 years, working for well-known news agencies such as Reuters and The Times. She's founder and executive director of Beyond Nuclear. Her new book is called No to Nuclear: Why Nuclear Power Destroys Lives, Derails Climate Progress, and Provokes War. She'll be speaking on Monday the 15th by Zoom to people at the Hartford Quaker Meeting House at 7 p.m. Good afternoon.
Hi, Stanley. I'm looking forward to that.
I thought we'd get into two areas concerning nuclear power and then talk about the claims of the worth of the so-called advanced small nuclear power plants. First, I wanted to ask about the extraction of the minerals and its human cost. And then at the other end, talk a little bit about the matter of nuclear waste. Usually, when talking about nuclear power, the conversation starts with the power plants, their safety, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go to the very beginning. What mineral or minerals are needed for nuclear power, and who mines them, and what's the problem there?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head there, I think, which is that the conversation about nuclear power is only ever about the generation phase. And I think a lot of people probably don't even know how nuclear power plants are fueled and perhaps think that they can generate their own electricity to power themselves, but that isn't the case. All nuclear power plants rely on off-site electricity to come into the plant to cool the plant. And so they are using uranium, which is mined across the world, actually. These days, there are not very many uranium mines operating in the United States. There were hundreds of them, mostly on Navajo land. And what happened to the Navajo people was that they took all of the health risks and were left with all of the waste. Because we have to remember that when uranium is mined, 80% of the radioactivity is actually left behind on site in a form which is called tailings, which is really radioactive sludges, rocks, mud, and so forth, and none of the so-called benefits. If you look at the Native American communities today, they're some of the poorest in the country. There are still many living without running water and electricity, and yet they were asked to mine this originally for nuclear weapons. And then after Atoms for Peace came in under the Eisenhower administration for Atoms for Peace, which is a sort of misnomer, but to continue to supply the uranium for the fuel in nuclear power plants. So that is sort of the forgotten story. And actually, in my book, one of the stories I tell about an accident at one of these uranium mines and mills in Church Rock, New Mexico, always surprises people. Even in our own movement, they say, wow, I never heard about that. And yet it was the biggest accidental radioactive release in American history of radioactive waste. And it happened the same year as 3 Mile Island, but nobody talks about it. And I think it's partly this sort of environmental racism where this is a community that's just been forgotten.
And what were the medical effects on some of the people in that area?
Well, that's a very good question because, as is often the case in these situations, there were no epidemiological studies, no real medical investigation, no real compensation or remediation. There was a minimal amount of cleanup done, but not nearly enough. So that community is actually still fighting today to get proper cleanup of their community and their land. It permanently contaminated the Puerco River because we had 90 million gallons of radioactive waste that flowed into the Puerco
Wait,
River.
let's highlight that number. 90 million gallons?
Yes, yeah. So that's
Wow.
why it was and there was also solid radioactive waste that went in as well. And that's why it's the biggest accidental release of radioactive waste in the country ever in the US history. But as I said, it was 1979, July, actually, interestingly, the same day as the Trinity test, July 16th, which
Hmm.
happened obviously decades earlier, but really a day of mourning for that part of the country now. But because it was just several months after the March 1979 Three Mile Island accident, which got a lot of attention, being in a different kind of community, that that's really, I think, the story of nuclear power is that it does prey upon the most vulnerable. It leaves them to deal with the consequences. The mining companies invariably just walk away after they've closed the mines. They change hands, they sell on, so it's a different company, and then it's a different company. It's like a shell game almost. No one's responsible. And so it's the communities that are left behind to cope with this. And now
And
what's
then you
happening, because there is a push for more expanded nuclear power, there's also a push to open uranium mines, more uranium
in
mines.
the United States.
Yes, for example, one is in the Havasupai who live inside the Grand Canyon. There's a push to mine right close to the Grand Canyon. Now their water supply is absolutely essential for their survival, and if that gets contaminated, that's really the end of their culture and their civilization. So they've been fighting that for a long time. But as you know, we've got a government now that is trying to fast track all things nuclear and doesn't care about the environment, is doing away with essential environmental laws like the Nuclear Environmental Policy Act and so forth. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and so forth. The Endangered Species Act. Everything's under assault now. So that's sort of smoothing the way to do this and dismissing the concerns of the communities that are directly affected.
Now let's jump to the other end of the process when the fuel rods are spent. What does that mean? That
That
a
means that they're
fuel
no
rod is
longer
spent?
able to generate a fission, so they are exhausted in a way. That's kind of why they use spent. We use the word irradiated, so they've irradiated enough that they're not going to be useful as fuel anymore. So they're offloaded first into sort of effectively swimming pools, and these are inside the reactor complex in a building. Depending on the design of the building, not necessarily very well protected from, for example, an attack from the air. But
Mm.
then they have to stay there for about 5 years to cool off thermally, mostly. And then they're offloaded into casks, which at the moment are stored on site. There's a big debate about these storage casks because we don't use very robust storage casks in the US, but even the more robust ones are still potentially vulnerable to somebody firing a tow missile or something, and that would penetrate these casks. So they should be protected more adequately than they are. So there they sit. There was an agreement made between the Department of Energy and the utilities that own these plants to move these casks to a deep underground geological repository. We know that that hasn't happened because the Yucca Mountain site, which was chosen, was cancelled. It's not completely gone. It could be revived, but it's not moving forward. And so all of the waste that's generated by nuclear power plants in the United States is still sitting on the sites where it was generated, which in many ways is where it should be, because why should we dump this waste on other communities that didn't ask for the nuclear power plants? But on the other hand, it represents a vulnerability. And so
You
our argument, at least at Beyond Nuclear, is, until you've solved the waste problem, which they may never, because we haven't yet, we've had many decades to try, you should not be making more of it.
without getting into the technical details too much, you have a startling sentence in the book that spent fuel rods are 1 million times more radioactive than the raw fuel at the start, if you could
That's right.
explain.
So after the fission process, it become much more radioactive, which is why they have to be protected in these pools to cool down and then in the casks, because all these radioactive isotopes, have something called a half-life, which is how long they take to decay. So a half-life, after the half-life is expired, then they are half as radioactive as they were before. So that doesn't even mean, if you have a 12-year half-life, like cesium, it doesn't mean it's completely benign after 12 years. It just means it's
Mm.
half as radioactive now as it was before. So we always say, you should multiply by 10, whatever the half-life is. So if it's 24,000 years, it should be 240,000 years plutonium and so forth. So that means they are lethally dangerous. They have to be submerged in the fuel pools, these fuel rods, because if you stood next to one, otherwise you'd be dead within seconds. And then they have to be protected in these while they still continue to cool in these casks. And then at some point, there should be something else done with them to protect them from society. Now, we argue that transporting them thousands of miles to a repository that will likely not contain them for long enough, because they've got to be contained and protected from humanity for at least 10,000 years, and arguably a lot longer than that. You don't want it, obviously, to leak and get into the groundwater and so forth and into drinking water, that we should protect them with something called hardened on-site storage, which means you leave them where you are, but you bunker them, you berm them, you reinforce them, you put them in reinforced containers, then concrete and so forth. They shouldn't be visible from the street or the air, and that way, that's really at the moment the least worst option. Is it a great option? No, but we haven't solved it. The industry has not solved this problem, even with the new designs, and may never. And so, again, we say the one thing you shouldn't be doing is continuing to generate it. And the focus should be on how to best manage it. But we've got, a lot of it sitting around at all these different sites.
Well, so speaking of sitting around, these things, as I understand it, are currently not protected from attack. I think you alluded to that a little earlier. And we have a place with the name of Chernobyl that was attacked twice. Once just a few days ago by a Russian drone that hit within, according to press reports, a few hundred yards from some of these dry casks.
Yes, I mean, the whole Chernobyl situation is by no means over and not a worry. I mean, the first attack that you referred to was a drone that hit, I think, a year, so it was February 2025, about a year after the invasion began. Although I have to say, when the invasion began, there was another issue with Chernobyl, which was the troops came in through that area and they were told to dig ditches, and they drove heavy machinery through there. And so all of this re-exposed radioactivity that was below the surface. And a lot of those soldiers undoubtedly got exposed to radioactivity. But what happened a year later was a drone hit the roof of it's called the safe confinement dome. So this is the structure that was built for many billions of dollars over the original sarcophagus. So when the Chernobyl reactor exploded, they needed to cover it with something quickly. So they built what they called a sarcophagus, which wasn't meant to last and didn't last, and was dangerously, potentially cracking, and now, in fact, in risk of falling down. And so this very expensive, multinationally funded dome was created and slid over it. That's what the hole penetrated that. So the concern now, which Greenpeace Ukraine has been sounding the alarm about very loudly now recently, is that because the original sarcophagus could collapse and there's a hole in the roof of the new one, we could see what is still highly radioactive waste released if there's any kind of a fire, released out of that hole. And so now we've got this added concern with these drones that are flying around hither and yon. I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether this was just an accidental misdirection that conveniently hit this building because there was only one, which sort of suggests that maybe it wasn't a deliberate assault on that building, or it was. We'll never know that, obviously. But the fact, when you see the picture of it, it's pretty alarming. It's sort of rubberized, that side of the building. It's adjacent to the building where the casts are. So a few hundred meters off course, and we could have been in a really dangerous situation, especially if there's a fire, because the fire is what lofts it into the atmosphere, and what happened with the original disaster, so that you got fallout all across what the former Soviet Union, but also into Europe. So there are countries, most countries in Europe got some, at least in the western part of Europe, got some dose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I find it staggering that the articles that I read about what happened a couple of days ago, they mentioned it. They said Zelensky said this was vile, and then they moved on. I mean, if it had actually hit those casks, I assume it would have been catastrophic.
Right. Well, you've got this really anomalous situation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, for example, which you invariably hear a statement from Rafael Grossi, who's the general secretary of the IAEA, after one of these incidents. For example, there's also the 6 reactor Zaporizhzhia site in Ukraine. That's in the southeast part of the country, which is really in the thick of the worst of the fighting. which was occupied almost immediately on March 4th by the Russians and has been under Russian occupation ever since, but nevertheless has also been the victim of close calls, fires, missiles, drones hitting buildings, not reactor buildings this time yet. And and what Grossi, because the IAEA has this sort of double role of being the UN watchdog on nuclear, but also an advocate of promoting nuclear power across the world, what he said on one of those occasions, well, it's not the nuclear power plants that's the problem, it's the war that's the problem. And you think that's completely disingenuous. I mean, he isn't, so he's saying this for propaganda purposes, but clearly most of us with any level of common sense can see that if Zaporizhia was a wind farm, he wouldn't be saying anything, right? He wouldn't. No one would have to say anything. So it clearly is the nuclear power plants the problem, because the possibility of what could go wrong if something happened at that plant in the middle of a war is so catastrophic. So it's intrinsically the nuclear plant and not the war that's the problem. But it speaks to the fact that all of a sudden we're in a situation there and in Iran, and even the UAE's reactor got hit in the latest conflict with Iran, that if you've got a nuclear power plant, it's a target, or B, just vulnerable if suddenly you find yourself embroiled in a war, which you might think would never happen, but absolutely could.
Happens all the time. So let's get local. Let's talk about New England. We are centered in Connecticut. So Governor Lamont and I think 5 other governors in the area are pushing nuclear power. They talk about it being advanced and modular, which sounds pretty exciting. And they want to have all these lots of nuclear power plants. So where do these plants exist now? Are they safer than what has existed before?
Well, to take the first question first, they don't exist. They are designs on paper. Well, probably these days not on paper, but in, metaphorically speaking. And they are concepts which are unproven, untested, unregulated, unlicensed. There's really nothing much happening so far. The only reactor that has any kind of a license is the Bill Gates reactor, which is the Natrium fast reactor, which this means that it's going to use and produce plutonium, which is the trigger component of the bomb. And we've been this route before. So, this is the breeder reactor, which was rejected years ago. Never was economical, it was never safe, and so forth. So that's destined for Kemmerer, Wyoming at the moment. But all that's happened is there have been a few shovels in the ground. So some holes have been dug, but that's about it, right? There's all sorts of plans, there's all sorts of aspirations, and they're calling it a nuclear renaissance, which I find, kind of offensive on 2 counts, really. One is that, and actually we had a wonderful briefing on Capitol Hill the other day with Joe Rome as one of our speakers, who is a former Department of Energy official, who said, if the real Renaissance had been anything like the nuclear Renaissance, we'd still be in the Dark Ages. And maybe we still are, he added. But the point is that they had a nuclear renaissance, so-called, in the mid-2000s, when there were going to be, again, 34 reactors applied for licenses, and only 2 ever got completed in Georgia. These are full-size reactors in Georgia, the ones we know how to build, the ones we're familiar with, right? And those took, years longer and ballooned massively over budget and raised the electricity rates for Georgians significantly. That was the Renaissance. That wasn't. And now they're calling it a renaissance again, which I think is, that shows a lot of chutzpah, frankly, because, if the first one is such a flop, why would you use the same name for the second one? But it's all aspirational fantasy. There's no there, and there's very likely not to be any there. But what's happened with these governors, I think, is this, this is all an effort. But they're jumping on this bandwagon of the buzzword now, which is affordability. So we must talk about affordability. And they're trying to mold nuclear into this affordability concept where it absolutely doesn't belong, because there is no argument anywhere in any of the science and any of the economics about nuclear power being the most expensive way to generate electricity and wind and solar being the cheapest way to generate electricity. So if you were really interested in generating cheap electricity for Connecticut, you would not be inviting nuclear companies into the state. You would be focusing all your time and energy and dollars on stimulating an industry which is growing incredibly fast and whose prices are dropping precipitously. Not the other way around. Nuclear is dying off and its prices are soaring. So it's a curious sort of virus that's affected all these governors, where they're obsessed with this idea of bringing in nuclear power to their state, but it has no correlation to affordability, has no correlation to jobs. It's, I think,
But they have appropriated in Connecticut $5 million to go to towns and cities and say, well, let's find a site.
Yes.
I
And they're
don't know
saying they're going to inform. They say, oh, we're going to inform the public. But when you read how they're framing this, they're not informing the public. They're bamboozling the public. They're telling the public this is going to be good for you. It'll be safe. It'll be cheap. It'll reduce your electricity rates, which is paramountly not the case. That in fact, I was looking at a document the other day where it said, I'll read it because it's so interesting. It said about 77% of the 2024 public benefit charge increase alone, this is in Connecticut, was tied to long-term nuclear procurement contracts, specifically the requirement that electric utilities purchase power from the Millstone nuclear plant. So this is all about keeping Millstone relevant, alive, going, profitable, if it is, and not about what's good for the public. What they're doing all over the country is coming in and trying to snow the public because they hope they don't understand radioactive isotopes and they don't know what the health implications are and they don't understand the economics. And they're going to say, we've got this new shiny object that we're going to put in the ground here that's going to be great for you. Your tax rate will go down, you'll have more libraries and fire trucks, and it's all mythology because a lot of the times these companies are fading away anyway. We saw the first plan for this completely collapse with NuScale, which went away because there was no investment, because it's not a good investment. I mean, there was some, but not enough. So they couldn't get enough buyers. So the whole thing collapsed and the prices kept soaring and the buyers were, oh, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to be part of this. So it's just not a good choice for human beings, the environment, the ecosystem. And it's certainly not an answer to the affordability issues, which could be addressed other ways.
Well, I am really looking forward to hearing your talk on Monday. For those who are watching this video, to get to the details, to the registration link, you would go to peace.org and you could sign up there and you could meet, well, we're not going to meet you in person. You're going to be speaking over Zoom. But you could hear her speak and do the Q&A, and then anti-nuclear organizations will have tables, and you can get literature. We'll have her book for sale at a cut rate price and much more. So I want to thank you again for speaking with me.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
All right, let me take it off record.